Thank you so much for joining us on the webinar we have today to talk about healthcare IT data. We're so glad you're here. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. Yes, we will record this webinar and send it to you afterwards. There will be a few interactive questions throughout, and we are excited to hear from you. So feel free to be next to your keyboard if you want to ask some questions. Okay, so let's get started. First, a quick rundown of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to go through what we're about. So, what is Flatfile? What's the problem that we're solving? There always comes a time in every project when you need to do a CSV import. So what is that? How do you solve for that? And how is Flatfile solving that today? Then we're going to talk about when it comes to onboarding these types of CSV files, what are the problems that a lot of these customers and these folks that are going through today, how are we solving them with an eloquent solution like Flatfile? And then finally, I think the reason that most folks are on this call today is to go through what we are doing here at Flatfile to make that problem solved. So before we go into things, some introductions around who we are. I am Austin Brown. I'm an account executive here at Flatfile. In my role, I help companies dissect the current pains of their problems with regards to CSV and XLS imports, and to help understand if Flatfile solves those challenges. Seeing hundreds of different use cases for CSV importers and working as a middleware engineer myself in a previous life, I'm acutely aware of the challenges businesses face when it comes to data onboarding. And I'm also excited to be joined by my co-founder, Eric. Eric, like I said, is a co-founder here. He worked in all shapes and sizes of software companies, including health tech, and he started this company to solve the pain that he lived through during that experience. And that's a great transition to talk about who we are at Flatfile. So as I just mentioned of Eric's story, Flatfile originally began as an idea from our two founders, Eric and David. After having to build a CSV import utility at multiple different organizations during their entire career. Realizing that this problem had no eloquent solution on the market, Eric and David started Flatfile, a SaaS data onboarding platform to provide a dynamic yet simple solution for organizations importing their CSVs and Excel files. From that time until today, Flatfile has grown from having over 500 customers, raising over $80 million and employing over 70 employees. Our investors include some of the biggest in the business, as you can see below. And in 4 years, Flatfile has been able to accomplish solving a space that has really not been touched in the SaaS industry to date. Our singular goal, to make data exchange a competitive advantage for businesses.
Thanks, Austin. Yeah, that problem is near ubiquitous, but is actually inspired by my experience in healthcare IT. So as Austin alluded to before, we both have some prior experience working with oftentimes very challenging healthcare data. And for me personally, that started when I started my career. My first job out of undergrad was running technical implementations for Epic, it's an EMR. And all of our biggest delays, the most anxiety, the most cost overruns were all coming from data or problems with data. And really it came down to this file-based data exchange. In the context of setting up a new EMR, effective data exchange isn't just important, it's a requirement. You can't go live on that software. And regardless of what type of sort of segment or part of the healthcare industry that you're in, it's almost always that way. I'll give you a quick example of why this is so important. Is when I was 9 months into my job, I lost $250,000 for one of my customers. And the reason why was because we ineffectively tagged a bunch of claims. And so when we submitted those claims for reimbursement, because they were tagged incorrectly with the wrong sort of like mapping of diagnosis to the clinical context, what ended up happening was we had to revert all those claims, resubmit them more than a week later after a dozen people cleaned up all of that data manually. And then it was the worst nightmare for our billing manager, who had a significant increase to their AR days and had to explain that to the board at the healthcare system. That's just one example of many. And really it all just comes back to this problem of, data not staying put. Like data, why don't you just stay put? Why don't you just stay where you belong? The challenge with that is that all of our, all of the health tech that we've built over time has tried to take advantage of new technology, as well as the ability to interoperate across different types of contexts or different segments. And so because of this, the data has to move. We have to share data with different systems, whether it's like the example I shared before, where we're trying to share information about claims outside of an EMR, or if it's in the context of doing a patient health population analysis or an analysis on sort of how you could better improve different types of clinical operations. No matter what, the data is going to be going somewhere, and that causes problems across different contexts, right? In the back office environment, it's an issue with your AR days. In the front office environment, it could affect patient outcomes. And across the ecosystem, this more broadly leads to inefficient or ineffective patient care at scale unless you have a way to handle the data that's moving around. And there's plenty of existing tools in the landscape that exist to solve this type of problem. So for example, on the reporting side, you could use like a standard, sort of more industry standard solution like Tableau or Looker, or maybe your native EMR has an analytics suite, or you've worked with a consultant to build out a custom solution. On the sort of like data transfer side, you have, again, like sort of larger, more generic solutions like Informatica and Talend. But you could also be using like an HIE. Maybe you're using Covenant Health, or if you're an Epic customer, you're using Epic Cogito in order to actually sort of like move data or health information around between different sources and targets. What's interesting there is that half of providers don't even use an HIE, and a lot of that is because of some of the vestigial challenges that exist in the industry, whether it's vendor lock-in or old data formats not really mapping well to new data formats, and the constant push towards having standards when it comes to collecting, managing, and sharing healthcare data.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. Well, Eric just went through some of the challenges in this industry and some of the tools they're solving. We'd love to hear from our audience members here today. What are the tools you're using to manage your HIT data today? And if you could write them in the chat, I'll wait a couple seconds while we have them come in, and I will ask them to Eric and see if he's familiar with these tools and how we're solving for them. See some coming in here. All right, Eric, I have Kyndryl Bridge is an example of a tool someone's using.
Yep, so that's just like basically an analytics, ETL solution, right? So like that'd be an example that's pretty similar to something like an Informatica or Talend, but designed specifically for the context of healthcare. And my understanding is like they do a lot of sort of like customize what it's called pipeline connectors from one source system to a target system.
Awesome. Okay, and I have Clarify as well here.
Yep, so that's more on like the analytics side. So if you're wanting to like get insight into sort of information or statistics about your patient population, maybe run some sort of like analyses. I don't have a bunch of direct experience with them, but I'm familiar with the name for sure. Okay,
and just a few more. I have Zapier on here.
Yeah, Zapier is more of a like generic example of a connector. So really easy way to set up event-based sort of like data streams. So like if someone clicks this button in the application, let's just say you have a physician click a button in an EMR, you want to be able to fire off an event, maybe to like a patient marketing thing. Maybe they decided to, subscribe, or the physician decided to subscribe or prescribe a particular type of medication, and you want to subscribe that patient to a list that's going to give them more information about that particular medication.
Interesting. Okay. And then I have a number in here as well that are something I'm very familiar with working as an account executive here at Flatfile, is homegrown solutions. A lot of homegrown solutions in the chat here as well. Home-built, custom-made loader with Java, custom homemade solution, custom. Yeah, lots of those in here too.
Oh yeah, and that's pretty common. Yeah, there's lots of options out there, but oftentimes we find ourselves falling back to the default, which is custom or built our own. That's actually why we built our own company called Flatfile was because of how much we saw that and how much we had to do it ourselves. This is something that I've had to deal with at every business I've been at before Flatfile, because basically there wasn't anything that I could plug in and say, hey, this fits exactly my business needs when it comes to accepting incoming data, either from my customers, from my vendors, or even within other parts of the business. It just happened to use different ways of storing and validating that data.
Awesome. I think that's all we got.
Cool. Yeah. So, I mean, thanks for sharing these. All of these are known tools. They're established in one way or another, whether they're built specifically for the healthcare IT context or whether they're more broadly just data management tools. And all of them require one specific thing, which is that the data exists in a known format and structure and location. The interoperability between different systems is a challenge because you don't really have any control over how the EMR decides they want to store the data. Or you don't have any control over how the clearinghouse needs to accept data in order to process your claims. And with the advancement constantly of database technology, it can be nearly impossible to keep up. And especially with the proliferation into cloud software, that causes even more challenges, because I guess quite a few folks on the call here are probably building sort of different types of applications that might be useful in a clinical, back office, or an operational context in healthcare. And you have your own system that has its own design for how it handles data coming in. And really turning the data files or data that you're getting from the outside into system-ready data can't rely on a known source and a known target format. And so what we end up doing is what a lot of you answered here in the chat, which is, hey, we're just going to roll our own. And that usually has three distinct flavors of what I call sweat-based solutions. The first one is professional services. This is part of what I used to do at Epic all day, every day, which was, hey, I'm a person who understands how to write SQL and write Python. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get big data sets and I'm just going to manipulate them manually in order to make sure that they fit the target structure and format that they need to be in. In health tech, this means risk of exposure for PHI. So when we had to do that, we also had to set up VMs with like rotating keys and like all of this extra security overhead, just to make sure that there was no possible way that in my work I could have exposed any type of protected health information. Second is sort of custom building. And that would be, so hey, we're going to go write a bunch of software to expect data in a particular way and then parse through that data and do all of the stuff that like an ETL system would do. But then you have to maintain that as sort of like an endpoint into your application. Whenever you release a new feature, whenever you let the customer customize things, there's a lot of brittleness that comes with that and less flexibility that is oftentimes necessary when it comes to especially the exchange of clinical data, but more generally data in this space. And then finally, there's also customer templates. So this is saying, hey, you know what? We're not going to do the work ourselves manually. We don't want to write the code. Here, customer, in order to work with us, you're going to have to put all your data in this structure and format in which we accept. That can work very well, but it's not necessarily the best introduction to a revolutionary piece of software that might change how they operate their business. And I'll just add that none of these solutions are necessarily exclusive, right? Like oftentimes we'll see our customers go, or the status quo for our customers being, hey, we built a custom solution, but we also provide our customers a template. Then they give us that filled out template of data. That custom built solution knows exactly how to process that data. So there's multiple failure points in the status quo, and that just leads to a high potential for error. And that's not what we want when it comes to actually getting the data in, because again, this isn't just an important or essential thing to do efficiently. In this space, it's a core requirement for any sort of data exchange or data interoperability.
Yeah, and as Eric just mentioned, there's a lot of rigidness in the tools that are out there to solve these problems today. And with that rigidness leads to inflexibility. They're not complete solutions for the problems you have. And so where does Flatfile come in? We solve for the nuance, the gaps that exist in the space today and how we're solving them. So much to the point we actually coined an entire new term called data onboarding. Data onboarding is meant to be a term that's non-ubiquitous. It's a solution that solves for the unknown. As Eric just outlined, there are requirements for data templatization in prior solutions. There is built constructed pipelines. What happens if you don't want to do that? Well, that's where we come in. So this is all the solution. The problems we're talking about are all easy when that data is in the right shape, or the data is already valid, or the software is designed in a specific way. But what happens when it's not? And that's why we've developed Flatfile as a tool. And that's how we've grown to have as many customers in such a short period of time. So let's talk about some of the folks that are using Flatfile in a customer-facing setting with healthcare data. I've demonstrated just a number of folks on this slide here, but I do want to drive into two examples about how some of our customers, specifically Neuroflow and Avia Solutions, are solving this today. So first, let's talk about Neuroflow. Neuroflow provides technology infrastructure that leading healthcare organizations need to deliver effective and scalable integrated programs that improve access to behavioral healthcare and lower costs. So that's what they do as a business. But what does that mean in data terms? That means lots of PII. That's contact information, standardized and non-standardized healthcare data. Lots of messy healthcare data that they need to standardize into their platform. So utilizing Flatfile's platform, the Neuroflow team was able to standardize all of their CSV and Excel files with regards to HIT data and imports in Flatfile, dramatically reducing the time to onboard customer data into their application. A great example of Flatfile being utilized to substantially make a more efficient back office operations. Let's talk about Avia Solutions after that. Avia Solutions provides addiction treatment and substance abuse treatment centers with revenue cycle management software to help their teams capture more revenue with less work. So very similar back office type of application utilizing Flatfile to standardize. So this also means PII, more non-standard data. Every different health clinic has a different way of submitting data, as I'm sure a lot of folks on this call are very familiar with. And what does Flatfile do is we introduce a way for them to accept data in non-standard formats programmatically. So not just via a drag and drop of a CSV or Excel file, we also have a programmatic ingestion of that data. And that consolidated all of their input streams, a lot of their back office operations, the need for that endless email cycle between customers in a non-encrypted, private way to talk about healthcare data and transmitting that data, all assisted by Flatfile. So this all sounds great. I can talk about many, many more customer stories of how they've successfully used Flatfile, but I'm guessing a lot of folks on this call want to see Flatfile in action. So I'm actually going to hand this back off to Eric, and he will walk through what Flatfile looks like in a healthcare IT data example.
Awesome. Thank you, Austin. And then let me just go full screen here. Cool. So what I pulled up here on the screen is the Flatfile platform. We're going to walk through a specific example today, but just wanted to introduce you to the concept of the Flatfile space. So a way to think about the Flatfile space is an independent sort of like micro application that is running in its own independent database. So in this example here today, this exists within my Flatfile account. However, all the data that goes in here is fully segmented and is isolated from any other sort of customer that I might be using to exchange data with in Flatfile. This gives you the benefits of data security and isolation, but also gets you the scale benefits of being able to run in a cloud platform.
And Eric, do you have to run it in the public cloud to use Flatfile?
No, you don't actually. So the entire application can be containerized. And so if there are specific requirements you have, whether they're cross-border, whether they're data tenancy or anything like that, we can very easily package this up and deploy it into your own architecture. And it runs exactly the same way. You'll still have the ability to set up independent, these independent spaces, which are their own databases for your customers. And you can also segment them by things like use cases and types of space that you want to deploy, depending on what workflows you have in your business where there is data exchanged. And so for this use case in particular, we're going to solve the problem that I had many years ago in making sure that all of our claims are getting appropriately tagged with ICD codes that belong to the context in which the claim is being reported on. And so in this case, when I've created this space, I actually set it up to preload a full ICD-10 reference here. So this is the entire sort of most recent 2023 ICD-10 code reference library. And all it has is just basically our codes, our descriptions, and the types of codes that exist there. There's a lot oftentimes of different types of referential data checks that we'll want to do in the context of any data exchange in healthcare. So this is just one of many examples. You'll see as we go through the demonstration how this particular reference data set gets used, but you don't have to be using ICD-10 codes. It could be lists of providers, locations, physicians, and sort of any other type of referential data set that you want to use to validate as well as to complete data in a context of data exchange.
And Eric, you mentioned that those IC codes were preloaded. How did they get there?
Yeah, so all of the codes got here just because they were preloaded when we created this particular space. So you can set this up to preload. You can have people load up their own reference data sets. You could also set up a pointer to look to a public data set if you wanted to as well. This will come up as a theme as we walk through the product, but this entire space is fully connected by API. And so if you wanted to, you could run an external check or an external lookup using just a simple API call. So let's go ahead and actually load in our claims data here. So as we're going through here, I will hop over to claims. And let's just go ahead and add the list of claims that we have from the Danville Clinic and the Danville Hospital. So I live in the lovely town of Danville, and unfortunately in our town, we have quite a few incidents with sports injuries, as well as people walking into the lampposts. They just put up a bunch of new lampposts. And not only that, but the Danville Hospital down the road is having to deal with a lot of sort of like MRIs that we're doing to make sure that people's brains are still effectively intact after they've run into all these lampposts. There's a few folks who've fallen into wells, things like that. So essentially, what we're doing here is we're going to load up claims. We're going to make sure that those claims are going to be actually attached to specific what I would call like ICD-10 codes, and then validate that the context is appropriate here. So what Flatfile is doing in this view, and actually, I think I might have gotten logged out. There we go. So what we're doing in this view here is when we've loaded up this data, it's existent now as a file inside of this space. So we have all of the raw data. If I went and looked at the raw data, I could see this here in my file. I might not necessarily need to use all of this data, but I do need to tell Flatfile what of this data I want to use to validate that these are all accurate claims that should be submitted. So if I hit this import button here, what Flatfile is going to take me through is this mapping interface where it allows me to say like, hey, this is how the data was tagged coming into the system, but this is how we want it to be tagged when it gets loaded into the actual database behind the scenes. You'll notice here that Flatfile is able to pretty easily auto-identify all of the different sort of incoming values to the destination fields. And so the reason why for this is, again, back to that benefit of being able to have an isolated database, but operating off of a cloud platform, is Flatfile can learn intelligently as it sees different examples of this within your workflows, and then automatically apply how we believe the data should be mapped, but always give you the opportunity to go in and review and update any of that should it be incorrect. Additionally, you might be dealing with data that is sort of like subcategorized or mapped within the data set itself differently from the source as you want it to live in whatever your target system is. So a short or small example of this here is that incoming, we had, hospital and clinic is sort of the values on the actual type of claim here. But we actually want to set those to hospital and professional to match more closely with the FHIR format that would be expected if I were to then pipe this into, let's just say, a FHIR formatted XML. So then in here, once we actually have the workbook loaded up, this is, or I guess I should describe the context of the workbook first. So in our workbook, what we have is we have all of our data now broken down into specific records. And this is the table that exists on top of that database that I was talking about before. So this space has a database behind the scenes. It's just an SQL database. And in this database, we now have tables that are populated with this record data. This helps us with a couple of things. The first is it helps us operate really quickly. So we went through and did a ton of validation and updates in just a couple seconds here. And that's relying on the fact that there's a simple but really fast and powerful architecture behind the scenes that allows us to pull and push this like we would large sets of SQL data. The other thing is that it's type safe as well too. So like in here, just as an example, these are all like tagged as numbers and they're stored as numbers in the database. When we have enum values, they're stored as enums, and similar types of ways that we make sure that all the data from a technical perspective all has the right type as it's coming in. Additionally, when we're running this, we're not only loading the data against the target data set, but you can pre-configure Flatfile with validations that allow us to check to see the validity of that data to determine, hey, is this a good record or a bad record? The nice thing about this is it's a check before we try to send that data to your database. So let's just say you have an application that needs to accept this data. Flatfile will pre-tag it as valid or invalid according to the rules of your system. So that way, if you wanted to run a progressive load of data, you could get all the valid records in and just save the rest of the invalid records for review by an individual or to be processed by some sort of function, as you'll see in a moment here. But as some examples of how these validations are run, a good one here is just on a simple one here would be on a unique value. So if I go over here to invalid, I can see what all the invalid ones are. And let's just see if there's any invalid IDs. So a simple validation that can just be run out of the box is just simply a flag in Flatfile that you set would be a uniqueness flag. So in this case, we've got two claims that have the same exact ID. And the system is saying, hey, these need to be unique IDs in order for this to pass this validation. So if I were to update that ID, then that's no longer going to be an invalid ID. Another place where we could possibly, I don't think we have an example of this in the incoming data, but just simply like missing required values. In this case, we've got a patient and the patient's required. If that's missing, Flatfile is going to flag that as invalid. And then as that gets flagged as invalid, what we can do is, again, you could push the data to a target system, but only the valid records, and anything that's invalid could be flagged in here for review, which is really easy to filter on. And then if we wanted to go to a specific type of error, we could always do that here as well, too. One other thing I wanted to note as well is that you can build safeguards into the Flatfile system that allow you to effectively sort of like default in things where you know that there's a common value that needs to exist in the data set. A good example of this here is an insurer. So in insurer, we have this one particular claim, Brady Helling. If I went back to the original file, go and look at this here, you'll see that Brady Helling didn't have an insurer. But we know that if we submit this data, there has to be some sort of value in insurer in order for this to be processed. Even if they're just self-insured, we need to have some sort of value there. And so what we've done in the actual data set itself is we've set a default value just to NA that allows us to say like, okay, cool. We know that there's not sort of like an external insurer on this particular claim.
And Eric, where are the ICD-10 codes coming into play with this data?
Good question. So over here, we have this diagnosis code, and I'll also pull over this diagnosis description. So you'll see there's been a lot of people struck by soccer balls, struck by footballs. Some poor soul walked into a wall here. This is all being pulled in from that referential data set. So this diagnosis code, actually the target list of valid values here is getting pulled from our ICD-10 reference. So this ensures referential integrity across both sort of parts of the data set, but again, across this entire, what we call in Flatfile workbook. A simple analogy to think about this is we're all familiar with an Excel workbook. This is very similar to an Excel workbook, but it happens to be database connected, and it knows all of the validation rules that exist in your system, which means that you can really easily provide guidance and also auto transformation to allow for an effective sort of like data journey. You don't want to get people involved in repeatable tasks, especially with health data around things like setting dates. A good example here is all these dates right here have been auto formatted into our target format. And if we go back to the original file, you can see that the way these came in was in a different format that may not have been acceptable to a target system. And you can customize these things and run them automatically as transformations to make this process a lot easier for your customers. The other thing here that I want to show off real quick is that you can also allow different types of actions to occur in the context of a space. So a common one here would be, hey, I want to just like push this data to go ingest it via an external API. So a really common implementation approach for our customers is they'll send this out like a webhook, and then what they'll do is they'll then subsequently query Flatfile's API to asynchronously load the data in. And so if I go over to this webhook site here, this is just a mocked up example of this. You'll see that I've triggered a webhook with all the appropriate IDs to allow us to then fetch the data as it exists in the space from the Flatfile API. There are also other examples that you might run where it's like, hey, I want to run like a bulk action, but I don't necessarily want that to be run automatically. A good example in here, if we go ahead and pin our payees, is the fact that I've set this up to get paid out on a bunch of folks' claims. We don't want to pay Eric on everyone's claims, though. We want to pay the appropriate, organization or provider or patient, depending on who actually is tagged on this particular claim. And so in this case, we've set up an action here. It allows us to replace all the payees with the appropriate organization. That would also then no longer flag these as invalid. So you see here that like we already are saying, hey, these are invalid claims, right? There's no way that our friend Brady, who happened to be struck by a soccer ball, should have Eric get paid on their claim. It should be whoever provided the service. And so in this particular case, we'll go ahead and run our action. And then what's going to happen here is we're going to replace all of those invalid payees with the appropriate payee based on the data that's contained in that claim.
Awesome. And Eric, if I had maybe some teammates, or if I wanted to invite a customer to be collaborative on this type of onboarding session, how would I do that?
Yep. So in here, if you go hit collaborators, it's just as simple as sending an invite via email. It appears very simple, but behind the scenes is really cool how this works. So when I were to say invite Austin, so if I say, hey, Austin, I need you to, can you make sure my claims look good? I could send an invite to Austin with a message. It's going to trigger that by email, but it's also going to send Austin like a secure access link and token that's only available to Austin. And the other part of this too is that Austin's only going to be able to access this one particular space, which means that Austin can't go and access all the other spaces for, let's just say, the San Ramon Physicians Network or the Walnut Creek Physicians Network, because Austin hasn't been granted access explicitly to that one space. The other part of this too is that, as we mentioned before, I'll probably say it many more times again, this can all be instrumented by API. So you could, generate a space by API, preload data into that space's database by API, and also invite external collaborators by API as well. And in addition, on top of all of that, the entire platform is fully instrumented with events that tag everything that happens here. So if I go ahead and send this to Austin, it's going to send him an invitation. But what happens behind the scenes is that our platform actually records an event, who did that event, and any additional context that exists around that event too. So just for the more technical folks here, I'm going to hop over into Postman. I'm just going to run a simple request here in the platform that shows me every action that was triggered over the course of this demonstration. Now, all of these might look like a little bit challenging to read, but I'll just give you a quick example. In here, we can see when data got updated. You can see who actually did the updating to that data, where the update actually happened in terms of the actual sheet and the workbook that was in. And then you can also see specific URLs like data filters or other things that were applied in that context. So when it comes to auditability and traceability, this platform basically has sort of that full picture that you want. And whether you want to go grab all of these as just sort of like a raw event log, or whether you want to publish these maybe to one of those analytics tools that you have internally to track who is working on what type of project. The sort of sky is the limit here in terms of the ability to integrate Flatfile into the existing tools and architecture that you already have. Jumping back into just our demo here, some final notes is that entire event-based architecture is run off of a publish and subscribe architecture. But this demo itself was based on the FHIR schema, and the internal keys for all of these values that you see here are structured in sort of like a standard FHIR JSON format. So this space could be one that's embedded inside of an application. Let's just say we want to let people import a list of claims to do some sort of claims analytics. We could do that. We could also trigger this within a particular type of, or within a workflow that happens external to a software application, and just load the space like a microsite. Again, each one of these spaces has their own auth and allows you to sort of store data and work with this however you like. And another key point I'd mention here is just that even though I'm using sort of the claims FHIR spec in order to define the data model here, you don't have to be importing claims. You could be importing any type of data structure and have any sort of set of validation rules, because you get to control how Flatfile is designed and set up. And we've got a bunch of really easy to use SDKs that allow us to configure Flatfile in order to meet whatever the requirements are of your business. And so just if you're a developer who's listening in and you're interested in talking more about how to use Flatfile and configure Flatfile in the context of anything related to healthcare, feel free to shoot me a note. I'd love to talk about how we're thinking about handling nested fire in a flattened JSON API format. That can be a particular challenge, and that's one of the things we had to address when we were working through this demo. So anyways, thank you so much for letting me show you a little bit of the Flatfile platform, and I will hand it back to Austin, who will wrap us up, and we'll move on to Q&A.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate you walking us through that. I foresee a lot of Danville residents getting their claims submitted promptly now with all these sports injuries. So quickly, before we jump into Q&A, I'm just going to do a recap here of what we talked about. So first of all, why is data onboarding mission critical? Well, consistently delivering high quality data is essential to achieving patient and revenue-oriented outcomes. As Eric mentioned in an anecdote that he had today, there's sizable business impact for getting these things wrong. And that's what Flatfile is here to help solve for. What's often forgotten when trying to solve for this is that the status quo, as we mentioned, doesn't always solve for your unique business challenges, your unique data challenges onboarding. So doing those standardized platforms that we talked about in our Q&A today around the solutions you guys are using often doesn't solve for the uniqueness and entirety of your challenges for data onboarding at your organization. And how can you handle that data that you can't plan for? Well, we have contingencies in place. As you saw today, there's ways to programmatically allow for data cleanup, having a human in the loop, so humans can be involved in that process as well. So you have that redundancy built in instead of just force feeding a specific manual process that takes time or an automated process that might be prone to errors. And that's what we had for you today, folks. I really appreciate you joining us as we went through the platform and talked about the inception of Flatfile. As a reminder, we will be sending out the recording. So if you do want to share this and build a coalition internally with the fun stuff we shared today, we will share that with you. Alternatively, we're also going to be emailing you if you can reply to that, if you want to chat with us. And if you get off this webinar and you say, wow, this is amazing, I really want to get a demo of this ASAP. Well, you can email us at hello@flatfile.io. We'd be happy to answer you in that meeting as well. So we still have about 15 scheduled minutes left in the webinar. I'm going to open it up to some Q&A. Eric and I are going to hang around here for the next 15 minutes, and we'll answer any other questions that you might have while going through this presentation today. Oh, and perfect. Noel just linked in the chat to everyone a link to get started with Flatfile if you want to take a look at some of the documentation that Eric was discussing today. Okay, so I think some folks are typing. All right, Eric, I have a question for you. It's regarding file feeds. So it seems like someone wants to talk about how this programmatic data gets ingested into Flatfile. We talked about manual stuff a little bit today, but how does it work programmatically?
Yeah, so I'll probably say the API word one too many times again, but each space comes with its own API endpoint that allows you to load files to that space. So we've already seen your customer set up Flatfile as sort of like a destination for an SFTP bucket, where essentially they'll set up an SFTP site that's shared with their customer. That customer will run a cron job to drop a file in that SFTP site. And then Flatfile's customer will have a Lambda or a script set up to pull the file off of that SFTP site and drop it into the Flatfile space that's correspondent with that customer, all via API. In addition, on top of that, you can also instrument everything that you saw me clicking through in the application there today. So using Flatfile's SDK, you can go in and say, hey, I don't want the user to do this action. I want the system to do this action. And then every space comes by default with what we call an agent, who behind the scenes is basically doing all the things that a user might otherwise do in terms of clicking through or making changes in the application. So you can absolutely manage a file feed through this system. And basically all you need to do is just tell it like, hey, what are the things that we want to have happen automatically? And what are the things that we want it to stop operating automatically on if we notice an issue or something wrong?
Awesome, thanks. And we have several more questions coming in here now, Eric. I have one from Casper. Where or how do you define data quality validation rules in Flatfile?
Yep. So also a fun answer with a fairly extensible platform. But the most common way we see our customers defining this is with our SDK. So with our SDK, what you can do is you can load in all of the different sort of field and schema definitions that you have in your platform. And then you can write sort of like standard validations. A simple one would be like for a field that is required, it's just simply in Flatfile, you type required equals true. And that would make that a required field whenever someone uses that particular schema. You can also write more advanced validation rules as well. And those would be written in sort of like just standard JavaScript. So you could go in and say like, hey, if this one field is present, then this other field must have a value. So you can also write basically anything that you could logically program into a function into Flatfile. Alternatively, you could say, hey, Flatfile, we already wrote a bunch of validation rules. Can we just pipe this data through our validation rules and send Flatfile back a response? That's absolutely possible here as well too. So the entire data set that you saw in the data table during the demo is made available as a JSON object that you can then push out to an external system and then return back to Flatfile with messages and validation flags attached to it to say like, hey, this data is invalid, and any type of custom message that you might want to apply. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you define those validation rules, but usually the starting point with our customers is, what is the core sort of like data schema? What are the basic validation rules? And what are any sort of like conditional or complex validation rules that we might need to either write in a function or leverage an existing function that you've already written?
Awesome. So lots of different ways to solve for it, whether it's Flatfile provided or custom built. Okay, we have another question from Jonathan. He's asking about our SOC compliance. So can you speak just a little bit about our security posture here?
Yep, so good point here. The Flatfile is SOC 2 type 2 compliant. So if you need to attest to that we can provide that type of certification. Also, we do have a HIPAA compliant cloud environment as well too. So those customers that Austin was sharing stories about are running Flatfile in Flatfile's hosted cloud. So they're not hosting themselves necessarily, because Flatfile is able to attest that we are encrypting the data both at storage and at rest and not exposing unnecessarily any type of PHI. If there's any other specific security questions that you do have, you're more than welcome to shoot them to hello@flatfile.io. We've gone through this process with some of the largest businesses in the world that deal with large amounts of PHI, including Fortune 500 insurance companies, consulting firms that are dealing with lots of PII, and a variety of others. So yeah, feel free to shoot them our way. But the most important thing for us is, as someone who is an intermediary processing your data, to ensure that that data is safe, secure, and then also performant. You can move it around between different places without having to worry about any type of leakage in that data set as well.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Eric. And I have another question from Janine. She's asking about file types. Do you support anything besides CSV and Excel file types?
Yeah, great question here as well. I know during the demo today, we just showed an example of a simple CSV. Behind the scenes, the entire Flatfile platform is extensible. So along with things like setting up orchestration to automatically jump through events, you can also set up what we call like a plugin that allows you to extract data from whatever type of file or format that you have. So whether it's a Flatfile supported plugin, so for example, we have one for Excel that I just didn't happen to demo today, or if it's one that's proprietary to your business, you can tell Flatfile like, hey, when you see this type or this extension of file, I want to use this plugin to then go extract that data into a standard, JSON format. So behind the scenes, right, like you might be starting with a file that's even just a CSV, But then you need to get that file into a format that can be interpreted as a workbook, as you saw in Flatfile. And that approach is fairly simple. It just oftentimes has dependencies that are specific to a format of file that's coming in. But short answer is yes, absolutely. We could support pretty much any type of file format. We've done all different types of extractors from XML to SQL, et cetera. And we're more than happy to provide guidance if you're attempting to roll your own sort of plugin into the Flatfile ecosystem.
Fantastic. And I think that is all the questions we have in the chat. If anyone still has any more questions, again, don't hesitate to reach out to us either as a reply to, actually, we have one more question sneaking in here, Eric. How many collaborators are allowed in a space from Mariana?
Good question. So there is no technical limit to most of the things that you see here in Flatfile. That includes the number of collaborators that can be in a space. So you can choose any number of external collaborators to jump in, and that probably makes sense depending on your business, right? Like in some cases, you might have a more complex project that needs to involve 20 different distinct members, and in other cases it might be a smaller customer that you're onboarding that needs only a couple folks to be involved in the actual sort of like review and processing of data as it gets loaded into your system.
Awesome. Well, that's some great content there, Eric. I appreciate you walking through those questions with some answers. And like we were saying, if you want to follow up with us after this call or after this webinar here, you can reach back out to us with the email you're going to get shortly after this with the recording of today's webinar, or you can reach out to us at hello@flatfile.io. We'd be happy to show you a little bit more about the platform and talk about your specific use case. Thank you all again for joining today's webinar, and I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.